Thank you. Good morning. How you guys doing? You're all looking really good, and you're making me feel pretty self-conscious, like I shouldn't have worn jeans. We got two jean wearers over here. Anybody else wearing jeans in the house this morning? All right. I feel a little bit better about myself. So you're one of those fancy dressing churches. I don't even have dress pants anymore, man, you know. I gave them all away. Well, it's an honor to be back with you guys this morning. I was with you, I'm not sure exactly when it was, maybe about a year ago or something, and we had a good time then, but it's an honor to be back. We're just going to jump right into it this morning without a whole lot of commercials or anything like that, because I don't have any to make, because I don't have any books or anything with me. Don's already told you. I do have one book out right now. If you're interested in getting it, you can get it from my website, which is just my name, jeff-turner.org. That's Jeff, like with the minus sign, turner.org. Or just search my name on Amazon and it'll come up. So I have those there, but I don't have any with me this morning, unfortunately. But let's see. My wife and kids say hi. And Michigan, where I come from, is cold. And that's pretty much all I have to say about that. So let's just, let's jump right in. Let's go to Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. I'm going to be sharing with you this morning out of my next book that isn't out yet, but will be out hopefully before Thanksgiving. And the title of this book is The Atheistic Theist. And its intention is to make you an atheist concerning every God who does not look like Jesus. And also to show you that not only can, but you should embrace Christianity minus religion. In fact, it's the only way to embrace Christianity. So we're going to talk about that a little bit this morning. We're going to talk about religionless Christianity. Religionless Christianity, all right? So in Galatians 4:4, we read this, and we're going to read verse 5 as well. It says, "When the fullness of time had come, God sent His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children." Now, no further commentary on that verse. We'll get back to it. Religion. What is it and where does it come from? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, more than half a century ago, asked the question, is it possible to embrace Christianity minus religion? Because he felt approaching a wholly religionless age, an age in which men and women no longer approached the world in the context of religion. And so what relevance does Jesus, what relevance does the gospel have in such an age? And in case you've been in like cryo sleep, we're kind of already there. Okay? You know, humankind doesn't really approach the things of this world in the context of religion anymore. One of the reasons we embraced religion, Freud tells us that religion will persist so long as we have a fear of death. Well, even that fear of death is on its way towards being exorcised. I mean, even just secularly speaking, we're living longer than we've ever lived before. By the time we get to 90, I think most people are like, I'm not afraid anymore, just let me go. And I mean, there are already conferences being held all over the world dealing with how we're going to function in the age of transhumanism, in the age where we no longer die. Because our brains are simply, our consciousness is simply going to be able to be uploaded into the cloud. And we'll be able to think a thought and be from here to there at the drop of a hat. I mean, that sounds ridiculous. That sounds like beyond Star Wars. But those are actually the conversations that are going on in our day. That's actually the era in which we're living. And when you can no longer scare people into the loving arms of Jesus with the fear of death, what do you have to use? What relevance does the gospel have anymore? I mean, we're living in an era like that. That's all I'm trying to tell you. We are either already in a religionless period of time, or we're far closer than Bonhoeffer ever was. And so he asks the question, is it possible to understand Christianity in a religionless manner? And he asks the question, which has haunted me for years, can Christ be Lord even of the religionless? So I think first we have to kind of ask the question, what is religion? What is it and where does it come from? And so in order to kind of help us understand what religion is and where it comes from, let me tell you about the bathroom door in the house I grew up in. On the rear side of the bathroom door in the house that I grew up in the upstairs bathroom, there was an artist's rendering of an erupting volcano with dozens of cartoon characters fleeing the lava flow and the pyroclastic flow for their lives. And I can specifically remember seeing Big Bird, Cookie Monster, Ernie and Bert, and a few others. Those aren't cartoon characters, those are just children's show characters. But there were cartoon characters as well. And it seems like a really odd feature on the backside of a bathroom door. And what was even more odd was that after every bath I took, another character seemed to appear in this work of art. And the fact of the matter is, this wasn't actually an artist's rendering of an exploding volcano with cartoon characters fleeing from it. This was actually just nothing more than a water-damaged door. But our brains have developed in such a way that we can detect agency where there is none. So I saw intelligence in something that was completely and totally random. No artist had put brush to canvas and created this painting. I had simply splashed a little bit too hard in the tub and damaged the door, and it was nothing but a bunch of blobs on the back of the door, but my childish brain looked at it and detected agency. There must be some kind of intelligence behind this because, dang, that looks like Big Bird. And that looks like a volcano. Our brains have developed in such a way that we detect agency where there is none. And that's because when we were developing as a species, you were more likely to survive if you interpreted something as having an intelligent agent behind it than just interpreting it as being a breeze or something. So if you're strolling through the savanna of Africa and you hear a rustling in the bush, you're more likely to survive if you assume it's a lion rather than assuming it's a breeze. And those who assumed there was intelligence behind the rustling in the bushes were more likely to survive, and they passed that on to us. And that's why to this day, we detect agency oftentimes where there is none. And so it's likely that our first, early humanity, we're hearing the thunder up in the sky, and we're seeing lightning streak across the sky, and tornadoes and earthquakes and all this kind of stuff. And what is doing this? Well, there has to be some kind of intelligence behind it, because if we start a fire, we started the fire. It didn't just start on its own. If we construct a little dwelling place, we constructed the dwelling place. It didn't just arise out of the earth on its own. There's always intelligence behind these things. And so when we hear the thunder, when we see the lightning, when we see the tornado, whatever it is, we assume something has to be doing this. And so this is where our concepts of gods come from. This is where the pantheon of gods that different cultures worship come from, because we detect agency behind these naturally occurring events. And so these are gods. Now that's how religion emerges. Now if you have these gods, naturally you have to develop a system in order to keep them on your side. Because the things that they're doing, like sending the rain and causing the sun to rise and all this kind of stuff, this is all stuff that your survival depends on. Right? I mean, even the continuation of life seems to be connected to the cycles of the moon and things like this. So you want to make sure that you have these gods on your side, because you want your women to be fertile and you want your land to be fertile. And you know what I'm saying, the kind of stuff that early humans would have been thinking about. So you have to develop a system that will cause these gods to smile upon you rather than to smite you. And so religion emerges, and it looks different depending on which culture you're talking about. But a system emerges that says this is how we engage these gods. This is how we communicate with these gods. This is how we we lasso them into blessing us rather than into blasting us, and whatever. Religion emerges. Now, another phenomenon occurs in human history, and that's the concept of sacrifice. Now, it could have emerged within the context of religion. It could have emerged outside of religion, and then the two were eventually merged together. All we know is that both of these things emerged and were merged. So what is sacrifice? Well, depending on who you read, you're going to get a different, Freud tells us that sacrifice is connected to the Oedipus complex of a child wanting to murder his father, and so the sacrifice was kind of a symbolic way of enacting that. Or Levi Strauss has a different understanding of it. I tend to be on the Girardian side of things. Now the now late René Girard, whose absence we definitely feel, a great thinker and philosopher and theologian who passed on just a few days ago, gave us a concept of sacrifice just a few decades back that has really rocked the theological world and has rocked my own world. And he gives a definition of the emergence of human sacrifice that sounds something like this. And this is a really condensed version. If you want to get it, read his book, Violence and the Sacred, that I think might be thicker than mine. But he talks about sacrifice as something that emerges as a way of dealing with conflict between humans. So he talks about what's called mimetic desire, and that is that we don't want what we want what we think others want. And so if you want something, I immediately think it must be valuable, and so I want it too. Think about the girl everybody had a crush on in high school, and when you go back and you look through your yearbook and you're like, what was I thinking? And then the girl nobody wanted in high school, you're like, she was a lot better looking than the girl that everybody wanted in high school, and I could have had her, right? But why was one so desirable and one wasn't, even though maybe physically speaking, one would be considered more desirable than the other? Well, because everybody wants the one, everybody wants the one. We assume it's valuable, and so we mirror one another's desire. So when you're living in these small tribes, when we're developing as a species, and I want what you want and you want what I want, we're going to tear each other apart. Okay? And so the only way to survive a conflict like this is to find one individual or one smaller group of individuals within the society that we can persecute, kill, and scapegoat, and then we will all survive. And so as Girard puts it, the war of all against all becomes a war of all against one. And so we choose one victim rather than victimizing one another, and that becomes whatever, the scapegoat. What happens in the aftermath of us turning all of our aggression towards one instead of towards each other is that we feel this catharsis, we feel this release, we feel peace, right? The aggression, it's kind of, it seems to have been expiated, and we're unified for a season. Now, that feeling of unity we experience seems supernatural. It seems spiritual. And so there's a lot of things that we could have imagined. We've already imagined these deities that are behind the sound of thunder and earthquakes. So perhaps what we did to that guilty person or party appeased the gods, and they granted us this magical sense of peace. They granted us this unity that we now feel. And so eventually we attach that action to the worship of these gods. And a system is created. And of course, that action of scapegoating an individual or a group of individuals is going to have to be repeated. And so a priest class would emerge that is responsible for carrying out these acts of murder. They eventually become called sacrifices, and a whole system arises from it. That is religion. When I talk about serving God and following Jesus outside of religion, I'm not talking about religion just in the sense that, their music isn't very lively. They're just religious. I'm not talking about that's just a dead, dry religious church. I'm talking about this system, this monolith, which has been with us from the beginning, which is the only context in which we have understood God. We're now living in an age where that system is becoming obsolete. And it's not even just obsolete anymore, it's becoming obscene. And people are fleeing from it left and right. And we can either cling to it, or we can let it die. But letting it die and letting it go does not mean letting go of Jesus. Because Jesus never intended for us to understand Him or His Father in the context of religion in the first place. And that brings us back to the scripture that we opened with, Galatians 4:4. When the fullness of time had come, God sent His Son, meaning He comes from outside of the system. God sent His Son, born of a woman, born under law. God sends His Son from outside of the system into the system. For what purpose? In order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive the adoption as children. God enters a world dominated by sacrifice, dominated by religion from the outside, and He ruptures it from the inside in order to free us from it and introduce us to a whole new way of existing, to introduce us to a whole new way of understanding God. God comes into the system from outside the system in order to vaporize the system. The problem we've had, though, is that the very system God in Jesus seeks to bring down, we have read Him right back into. The very system God in Christ seeks to free us from is the very system we read God, the gospel, whatever, right back into. Hebrews chapter 10. Let's go there. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1. You guys still with me this morning? All right. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1. Since the law has only a shadow of the good things to come and not the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered year after year, make perfect those who approach. Otherwise, would they not have ceased being offered, since the worshipers, cleansed once for all, would no longer have felt any consciousness of sin? But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sin year after year. So the very thing that these sacrifices were aiming to do, which was to remove guilt and sin, whatever, and this is in a Jewish context for understanding sacrifice here, the very thing they were aiming to do, they could not do, they did not do. It simply reminded you that there still was a problem and God was still against you because whatever, okay? So long as the system stood, you would feel that God stood in opposition to you. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure." Then I said, "See, God, I have come to do your will. In the scroll of the book it is written of me." Do you have any idea how revolutionary of a statement that is? Do you have any idea how revolutionary of a statement that is when the book of Hebrews was written, let alone when Psalms 40 was written, which is where the writer of Hebrews is quoting from? That sacrifices and offerings you, God, have not desired. With burnt offerings and sin offerings, you have never been pleased. For a statement like that to be made in the midst of a world that is dominated by religion and that is ruled by God or gods who take great delight in sacrifice and in the shedding of blood, to stand in the midst of such a culture and say, look, the true and living God does not desire sacrifice. He has no pleasure in it whatsoever. In burnt offerings and sin offerings, he is not pleased. Dude, that's revolutionary. Now, after the Christ event, after Jesus, the writer of Hebrews finds this passage in the Psalms, and he's like, good God, this is what it's all about. That an event has occurred in Jesus that has really made this reality. That God does not desire sacrifice and offerings with burnt offerings and sin offerings. He was never pleased. Now, so let's just stop right there for just a minute before we go any further. Has God ever been into sacrifice and offering? Has God ever been pleased by burnt offerings and sin offerings? No, he was never pleased by it. Was it allowed? Sure, because God will speak our language, even in the same way you will get down on your knees and speak the language of your toddler. God will speak our language, but that doesn't mean that's where God wants you to stay. I watched hours and hours of Dora the Explorer with my daughter. I've watched hours and hours of all kinds of ungodly stuff I would never watch on my own with my kids. But I never made it a part of my life. When they went to bed, I didn't keep watching it. I spoke their language. It's what they needed, and so I would speak it for a season. But my daughter's 11 now, and she's not still watching Dora the Explorer. She's starting to grow up and grow past it, and part of my job as a father is to encourage her to move past some of those things and to become an adult. God, simply because he speaks the human language of sacrifice and offering, doesn't mean he backs it, doesn't mean he supports it, doesn't mean that it comes from him. It comes from us, but he's willing to speak it for a season so that he can ultimately rescue us from that system. And so, the writer of Hebrews, quoting Psalms 40, tells us very plainly, very clearly, God has never been into sacrifice and offering. He's never been into burnt offering and sin offerings. But there's a problem, because it seems like in the middle of the verse, it says, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you prepared for me. And so what we assume that means is that God is not into animal sacrifice, but he is into human sacrifice. What we assume that means is that livestock is not enough for God. He needs perfect human blood. And if that's the case, how are we any better than the Aztecs or some other culture that's kicking the virgin into the volcano? Guys like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens would be right in condemning Christianity as a cult of human sacrifice if, in fact, God is saying here, I'm not into animal sacrifice, but I sure do love me some human sacrifice. That's not what's being said here at all. What we have is a parallelism here, which means one thing is said and then it's repeated in different words, but it means the same thing. So what we're told is this: sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you prepared for me. Now here's the parallel statement. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure, which runs parallel to sacrifice and offerings you have not desired. What runs parallel to but a body you prepared for me? Then I said, see God, I have come to do your will. Meaning what? The body prepared for Jesus was not so that he could come and be the perfect human sacrifice that would satiate God's bloodlust. The body prepared for Jesus was so that he could come and carry out the will of God that sacrifices and offerings could not touch. He comes to accomplish the will of God, which is divorced from the system of religion and sacrifice. He goes on to say, when he said, the writer of Hebrews now, when he said, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings, even though these are offered according to the law. What does that mean? That means that it's not just that God wasn't into pagan versions of sacrifice. He wasn't even into Torah-based sacrifice. Though they're offered in accordance with the law, God in Christ makes a statement that these aren't pleasing to Father, Son, and Spirit. Never been into them, never been interested in them. Uh-oh. When he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifice and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings, though they're offered in accordance with the law. Then he added, see, I have come to do your will. He abolishes the first in order to establish the second. And it is by God's will that we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Things get interesting here. We're told God does not desire sacrifice in any way, shape, or form, but he prepares a body for Jesus so that he can come and carry out his will, which is divorced from the concept of sacrifice, even from Torah-based concepts of sacrifice, which means that Jesus is not the ultimate Torah-based sacrifice that finally satiated God's bloodlust and caused him to say, we no longer need the system anymore because someone has fed me everything I ordered. The will of God Jesus accomplishes and carries out is divorced from any concept of sacrifice. And it's called the will of God. He sets aside the first, that is sacrifice-based religion, in order to establish the second, which is what? Will of God, the will of God, which is divorced from the concept of sacrifice. And then it says this, and it is by God's will that we have been sanctified through the offering or through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. So we're told God's not into sacrifice. Jesus comes to carry out the will of God, which is divorced from sacrifice. But then what Jesus does is called sacrifice. How are we to understand this? How we are to understand this is that God absolutely redefines what sacrifice is in the work of Jesus. Prior to the work of Jesus, sacrifice is something that we offer to an external deity to secure its favor, to settle disputes between ourselves in order to accomplish that magical sense of peace. It's something that we give to a God who's up there and out there, who's not present in community with us. He's out there. And we draw him close. We secure his favor. We purchase forgiveness, however you understand it, through the offering of sacrifice, through bloodshed. But God, in the work of Jesus, redefines the concept of sacrifice once for all and says sacrifice, that is the thing that God is actually pleased with, the thing that God actually desires and wants, looks nothing like bloodletting and the killing of animals or humans. God's never been into that. He's been into something completely different, and it's what I do. That's what the Father's always been about. So then you got to ask yourself, what does Jesus actually do? Well, you rewind and you go back to Hebrews chapter 9. And in Hebrews chapter 9:22, we have that verse that we love to misunderstand that says that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Right? And we take that to mean God can't forgive until he kills something, which isn't forgiveness. That's vengeance and that's human justice. It doesn't say without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. The words of sins were added later. It simply says without the shedding of blood, there is no ophasis or there is no liberation from slavery. What is it we're being liberated from? You jump up to verses 14, 15, and 16, and you're told exactly what it is we're liberated from. We're liberated from a conscience that is haunted by sins that, as far as God is concerned, are dead. The writer calls them dead works. That's not a reference to works towards God that we did under law that God really had no regard for. That's a reference to sins committed under the law that, as far as God was concerned, were dead and of no account, but which were kept alive by the presence of the law, causing our consciences to be haunted. And so even though there was nothing there, even though as far as God was concerned, there was nothing that we needed to be judged for, the very presence of the system kept these sins alive in our minds, and so our consciences were haunted. But what happens is, in the death of Jesus, in the shedding of his blood, liberation occurs. Liberation from what? Liberation from the system that caused our consciences to be haunted by keeping our dead sins alive in our minds. It isn't that God is appeased through bloodshed. It's that the covenant which was inaugurated by bloodshed is also annulled by bloodshed, and something brand new is begun. So what do we see? God enters into the system from outside of the system to rupture the system and to introduce us to a whole new way of life. Prior to the work of Jesus, sacrifice is something we humans offer to an external God. But how Jesus redefines it is that it looks like something God steps down and does for us. It's something that God gives for us. It's not about us following some upward trajectory and trying to get close to a God who lives in a golden castle just hidden, beyond yonder cumulus cloud formation. And you know what? If you can send the smoke upward, you can secure his favor and whatever. That's sacrifice. Jesus redefines it. Sacrifice is not you trying to go up. Sacrifice is God making a downward move towards humanity and giving you an example and saying, this is how you live godly. Not by constantly trying to make some upward move to get to a God who's up there and out there, but by laying down your lives for one another, even as he did for you. That's all that God's ever really been interested in or wanted. And so the system is subverted and it's ruptured, and those with ears to hear are rescued from it. Our problem is that we've taken the very act of Jesus in rescuing us from religion, and we've put it right back within a religious context, and the death of Jesus becomes the ultimate sacrifice that satiates the external out there deity's bloodlust so that he can act kindly towards those who pray the prayer and recite the creeds. That's religion in its purest form. And it's the very thing Jesus comes to rescue us from. Okay, you guys still with me? All right. Let's move on here. Let's go to Matthew 21. Matthew 21. Take your time turning there as I have a sip of Ozarka, 100% natural spring water. Matthew 21 and verse 12. It says, then Jesus entered the temple, and he drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, it is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. The blind and the lame then came to him in the temple, and he cured them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did and heard the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they became angry and said to him, do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes, and have you never read that out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies you have prepared praise for yourself? So Jesus enters into the temple, and he finds a marketplace set up in which sacrifices are being sold at high prices to those seeking to worship God, whatever. And so he drives out the sacrifices. The very thing that religion tells you God desires, Jesus drives out. And he says, look, my Father's house is to be a house of prayer for all nations. This is supposed to be a symbolic place where anybody and everybody can experience some kind of connection with my Father. But you've turned it into the opposite. You've turned it into a den of robbers. He quotes from Isaiah, the house of prayer bit, and then he quotes from Jeremiah 7 when he says this den of robbers bit. In other words, what he's saying is, look, the very thing that this was meant to be, you've turned it into the very opposite of what it was meant to be. And you've introduced sacrifice, which stands opposed to what this place was actually meant to be. And he quotes from Jeremiah chapter 7 and saying, you've made this place a den of robbers. Now, Jeremiah 7 is pretty interesting, and so we're going to read from verses 1 to 11 because it's important to know that this is a passage Jesus has in mind when he performs this prophetic act of cleansing the temple. And it's interesting, we call it the temple cleansing, but the thing he cleanses it from are the very sacrifices we say his father was pleased with. Jeremiah 7, and we begin in verse 1. It says, the word that came to Jeremiah from Yahweh, stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word. Say, hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah, you that enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and let me dwell with you in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. For if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly with one another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your ancestors forever and ever. Here you are, trusting in deceptive words to no avail, those deceptive words, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name and say, we are safe, only to go on doing all these abominations? Has this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers in your sight? You know I too am watching, says the Lord. This is the passage Jesus has in mind when he performs this prophetic act of cleansing the temple. Which is, what is it all about? It's all about a people who are trusting in a religious system in which they believe God is safely confined, which gets them off the hook for everything else they're doing. We've got God trapped within this little house. We feed him his daily juice box full of blood, and we can go on doing everything we were doing. Oppressing the widow and the orphan, treating humanity like garbage, but the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. What's interesting is Jeremiah 7 goes on, and Jeremiah says, look, I never gave your ancestors any commandments regarding burnt offerings and sacrifices when I sprung them from Egypt. Jesus has this in mind. Jesus is performing an anti-sacrificial act by cleansing the temple, and he's saying, look, you are trusting in this system. You're trusting in this house where you think you've got God safely confined. You're off the hook for whatever you do, but I'm telling you what you're doing is actually an abomination. And the very ones you're trying to keep out, the blind and the lame, and all those that are displeasing to you, are the very ones my Father is seeking to gather to himself. The things that you think please my Father, all these sacrifices, are the very things that I'm going to drive out. And the very things you think displease my Father, the blind and the lame and the unclean and the ostracized, are the very ones that I'm going to call to myself. What's the point? Religion was getting in the way. It was fine for a season, but now it was getting in the way of the will of God being accomplished and carried out. The will of God being accomplished and carried out looked like including the excluded, bringing the broken close. But the system was excluding the very ones God was seeking to include, and so Jesus drives out the sacrificial system, and he calls the excluded to himself and says, this is what my Father's always been after, not this. And then it gets interesting. We ended in verse 16 of Matthew 21. Now let's go to verse 17. It says, he left them and he went out of the city to Bethany, and he spent the night there. And in the morning when he returned to the city, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the side of the road, he went to it and found nothing at all on it but leaves. And then he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. Now, another of the gospel accounts says it wasn't the season for, bearing figs. And so some have said that means God expects for you to bear fruit even out of season. That's not what this means. The reason it tells us that it wasn't the season for figs to be growing on the tree is because the author's trying to tell us there's something more going on here than just a dude cursing a tree. Then he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. And when the disciples saw it, they were amazed, saying, how did the fig tree wither at once? And Jesus answered them, truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, it will be done. Whatever you ask for in prayer with faith, you will receive. Now, what is this all about? The way we've interpreted this for years is that, if we really have enough faith, we can kind of tap into our inner Harry Potter and curse trees and make mountains move. It's Jedi stuff. God's, faith is a force, and you can tap into it and manipulate things. In 2,000 years, no one on record has moved a mountain. And I'm pretty sure people have had faith, unless this thing called Christianity has been a complete sham and failure. It's not happened. What's the point we're being told here? Not that we can perform magic tricks if we believe hard enough. What we're being told here is this. Look, Jesus says, if you say to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea. What mountain does Jesus have in mind? Where is he standing? He's on his way to the temple. What did he do the day before? He had driven all the sacrifices out of the temple, spoke a condemning word against it, saying, look, you're trusting in deceptive words, saying the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Meanwhile, you're oppressing all these people that my Father seeks to include. But this system is getting in the way. And then the very next day, Jesus finds a fruitless tree and he curses it and then speaks to his disciples about a new way of living, a new type of faith that he's come to introduce them to, in which they are able to say to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea. What mountain is he talking about? He's talking about the Temple Mount. The point being what? Look, this system is fine until it comes between you and carrying out the will of God, which looks like including the excluded and loving those religion says God hates. And the second it impedes you from doing that, cast it into the sea. In that sense, religion is dispensable. If you can operate within a religious context and still carry out the will of God, which looks like including the excluded and loving the broken and all that type of stuff, then okay. Your religion has served you well. But the moment it comes between you and that, throw it into the sea. Curse the fig tree. Isn't that beautiful? That everyone's concept of the will of God is this out there and up there God, or this behind the curtain God, who's demanding bloodshed, and that's a way we draw close, expiate our sins, secure his favor. And God is saying, to be honest with you guys, I long ago divorced myself from this system. Do you want to know where I am? I'm on the outside with the blind and the lame and with the beggars and all of those you're trying to keep out. Meanwhile, you're ripping people off by selling them sacrifices. I've never been into that. And so it's time for a whole new way of life. It's time for a whole new way of living. It's time for a whole new faith, something you've never seen before, that's breaking into your world from outside of your world, that's giving you permission to say into the sea with the mountain, let's follow Jesus, and including the excluded. All right, now we're almost done, I promise. Tray tables up, seat belts, all that kind of stuff. You do know I heard one person say, aw. There's always one person who makes me feel good. Everybody else is like, yes. So to the one who said, aw, let me assure you, I say that to give everyone else hope. To the rest of you who are like, yes, I'm sorry, we might still be here a little while. But not too long. Mark chapter 2. And let's go to verse 18. Religion is dispensable. Religion is not something God is confined within. Religion is not something that we must understand God within the confines of. No. God exists outside of the system. That's why his son comes into our world from outside of the system, because God is not a part of it. God will speak our language only for our benefit. But the truth is, God has always existed outside of this system. And so in order for us to truly understand who God is and what his will looks like, we also have to get outside of the system. And that's what Jesus comes to do. He comes to do away with the system that keeps us confined so that we can understand that the will of God, actually, it's this downward move towards humanity and not this upward move. Right? Even the sacrifice of Hebrews 9 and Hebrews 10, it's not this you who are removed from me, offer me something because I'm up here and out there and I've got needs, So give me some animal blood or whatever. Or commit genocide and I'll receive it as sacrifice. As some later Jewish commentators understood some of the wars and things commanded in the Old Testament. Right? He says, look, no. That's not what Jesus was all about, because that's not what the Father was ever about. The Father was not about, I'm up here, you try to get up to me somehow. The Father's always been about, I'm coming down. God's on a downward move. He's not calling humanity to come upward. God's constantly coming downward. And that's what's revealed in the cross. This is the event that changes everything. The cross is an event. Philosophers, theologians talk about, the event, this thing that changes everything. Like 9/11 is one such event, right? I mean, we divide history up into pre-9/11 era and a post-9/11 era. It changed the way we understand everything. The cross is such an event. It's not that the cross changes God. It neuters his wrath gland and turns his frown upside down and ladles him full of atoning antidepressants. That's not what the cross is all about. The cross is an event that forces us to understand history differently, to understand each other differently, to understand God differently. We can no longer approach God, humanity, history, ourselves the same way in light of the cross. It's an event that has changed everything. And so that's what's happening. So in Mark chapter 2, verse 18, we read this. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples fast and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" In other words, why don't you operate within the religious system? And Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests can't fast while the bridegroom is with them, can they? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away, and then they will fast on that day." Now, there's a large modern prayer movement that says this means that from the moment of Jesus' ascension until the moment of his second coming, we're to be in a state of mourning for him to return. And they actually set aside certain days every month where they fast to kind of beg Jesus to come back sooner, I guess. Because I guess the less we eat, the more anxious God gets to whatever. I don't know how that works. I'm not sure. Well, it hasn't worked yet, so maybe it doesn't work. But really what Jesus is talking about here, him being taken from them, is not about the ascension. It's about his death, the period of his death. There would be a very real season, 3 days it would last, of mourning that they went through, wherein they thought the one we followed and gave our lives to was a fraud. So religion, I just want you to see even the beauty here of this statement. Why don't you fast the way religion commands you to fast? Jesus says, well, because it's fake. And I don't operate in that system. But there's going to come a season when something very real happens to my disciples, and they'll be forced to fast. It's going to be organic, and it's going to be something real. See, religion demands you do things that have no fire behind them. But God calls you to live, right? And even if they misunderstood all of the things he said about resurrection, still, this was something that came from the gut, right? So, anyways, moving along. So why don't you operate within the confines of religion is the question. And then he says this, "No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak, otherwise the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and so are the skins. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." This is what, you want to know why I don't operate within the confines of religion? Because I am something you've never seen before. I'm new wine that comes from outside of the system, and you can't pour me into your old, stretched to capacity, cracked and dry wineskins. I don't fit there. I still have a lot of fermenting to do. And I'm going to expand, and I'll crack, and I'll break your system to pieces. So don't try to fit me in there. And right after that, we see this illustrated. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look what they are doing. Look, they are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath." Don't you love? There's just always a gaggle of these guys around to condemn everything that's going on. It's a lot like Facebook, right? You want to know, if you want a 21st century example of this grain field, just look up Jeff Turner on Facebook and read the comments. It's like, "We're hungry." Saw it. Doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath. Where did it come from? I don't know. And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God, and when Abiathar was high priest, he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." What's the point he's making? He's saying, look, even David, under the old covenant, which we say is a covenant where if you break the law, God had to smite you. Even under that covenant, religion was dispensable. Even under that covenant, David was permitted to break the law in order to satisfy him and his men's needs. Why? Because God has always been about human need first. Remember, because God's not the up there and out there God who's demanding we try to ascend upward. God is constantly on a downward trajectory. But religion says he's up. And so it would be better for them to starve than to eat that consecrated bread. And it would be better for your disciples to keep their hands in their pockets and not pluck heads of grain and eat them on the Sabbath because they're violating Sabbath. But Jesus says, look, man, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. In other words, what? Religion and all that it commands and demands was made for our benefit, not us for its benefit. And the moment it gets in between human need being met, then into the sea with the mountain. Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And so if Sabbath laws come between my disciples being fed and whatever, then you know what? Into the sea with Sabbath laws. Human need comes first. Not the needs of the up there and out there God demanding we feed him and bless him and stroke his ego. You guys still okay? All right. I should probably, this is filmed. I shouldn't walk all over like I normally do. Normally when I'm teaching, I'm like jumping off the stage and everything, so I'll stay put. Let's go to Matthew. No, let's go to Mark. Mark chapter 3, I'm sorry. I'm going to try to condense this so we can get done a little bit sooner. In Matthew chapter 12:7, which is the parallel account of the account we just read, the Sabbath grain field incident, Jesus says, if you had known what this means, and he quotes Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. So what happened here? Religion came between humans and their needs being met. It came between humans and mercy. And whenever mercy was impeded by religion, Jesus says, into the sea with religion. Now, Mark chapter 3, it says, and he entered the synagogue, and a man was there. This is right after, okay? This is right after the grain field Sabbath incident. Another Sabbath incident now. They're connected, and they're told this way for a reason. It says, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand, and they watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, come forward. And then he said to them, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? Now that sounds pretty ridiculous. What a dumb question. Is it lawful to do good or to do bad on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? Of course, it's never lawful to destroy life. But there actually was a debate around this issue in the time of Jesus. In Shabbat 128b in the Talmud, we read that it was said by some of the rabbis, look, if there's an animal in a ditch on the Sabbath day, violate the Sabbath, save the animal. Okay? Something called the Damascus document that comes from the Essenes. It said, you know what? Let an animal die rather than violate the Sabbath. So there were debates going on around this issue. And so Jesus asked them, what's your opinion? Is it lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? They're looking to accuse him if he heals this man with the withered hand, meaning they knew he had the power to do it, but they were going to condemn him if he did it on the Sabbath. So is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? But they were silent, and he looked around at them with anger, and he was grieved. And this is intensely worded in Greek. He was really ticked off here. To save life or to kill, they remained silent, but he looked around at them with anger, and he was grieved at their hardness of heart, and he said to him, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And then the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. They answered his question. To them, it was lawful to use religion to destroy life, but it wasn't lawful to use religion to extend mercy. They had become so warped, so jacked up, so possessed and overtaken by the system that they would do anything to keep the system alive and unchallenged. Even if it meant using the system to justify the taking of life because one dared to show mercy in defiance of the system. This reminds me of Paul's words in Galatians chapter 6, where he's talking about those who are urging this congregation's members to become circumcised. And he says, look, these guys just want to make a good showing in the flesh, that they may boast about your flesh. In other words, they want to boast in the scars in your genitalia because they convinced you to be circumcised. That's all their religion is about. It's junior high genitalia religion. They want to make a good showing in the flesh, and they want to boast about your flesh. And then Paul says, but may I never boast about anything but the cross of Christ, which does what? Which rescued me from the system that they're possessed by. And then he ends the system by saying what? He ends the system by saying, look, let nobody bother me any longer. Why? Because I bear in my body the scars of the marks of the Lord Jesus. He makes a distinction here between himself and the false teachers who are trying to push the Galatians towards being circumcised. He says, look, I bear scars in my body for your benefit. I've laid down my life for the sake of the church. These just simply want to boast in the scars they can encourage you to make in your own body in the name of religion. But I bear in my body the brand marks of Jesus, which look like other-centered, self-giving love. I've laid down my life for the benefit of the church. He's making a distinction here between religion and what this whole new creation thing looks like. In Jesus, we're introduced to a new way of life, which looks like, look, laying down your life for one another, loving one another, even if it causes you scar, even if it leaves you scarred, that's what it looks like. Religion is about pleasing this external God who demands that you scar yourself. Right? But when you operate outside of the system, you will even be willing to be scarred if it means laying down your life for someone else. You'll be scarred in both systems. The only question is who benefits from the scars. In religion, God benefits from the scars. In the kingdom, others benefit from them. And so this is the system that it's so caught up in itself that it's willing to do harm to others in order to keep the system running and functioning and operating. Jesus operates outside of it. That's why it seeks to destroy him. But then it gets amazing. Because it's the system's destruction of him that becomes the system's destruction. Luke 23, 44 through 46 says, it was about noon and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And while the sun's light failed, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. What's going on here? For years we've talked about the tearing of the temple veil as though it's God saying, hey, look, kids, Daddy's back on his meds, so it's safe to come over. That the tearing of the temple veil is God saying, hey, look, I've been dangerous for a few thousand years here. I've been all hopped up on wrath, and it's not been good. It's just not been good. So that's why you've not been allowed to come over. But now, my frown is permanently turned upside down. I've been ladled full of atoning antidepressants. I've been given my sacrificial snack. And so now, veil torn, come back over, kids. It's safe. I don't think that's what's being said here at all. Because the truth is, there was nothing behind that temple veil. It was barren. The ark had long ago been carried off. You don't want to go behind that veil because there's nothing there. So what's actually going on here? The tearing of the temple veil here in this instant, and I know the writer of Hebrews talks about the veil and the way into the most holy place being disclosed, but that's not the same author here, so it's not the same thing being talked about. What's being said here, I believe, is that this system that has told us it had God behind it is exposed to be operating all on its own. The thing it understood to be God was nothing but its own self. And so the system is exposed. There's nothing there. The God of religion, the God who nailed him there, the God who justified this act, does not exist. Meanwhile, the one whom the system nailed there does what? Cries out, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. So as to say what? God's not hidden behind temple veils on holy mountains in religious structures. He's hanging on crosses with the suffering, with the excluded, and with the victims of religion. God is not backing up systems that justify the victimization of those who operate outside of the system. He is standing in solidarity with the victims. And at this point, this is the event right here. This is the thing that changes everything. When religion is exposed as an empty, barren system with no God behind it. But the suffering are revealed to be those with whom God stands. This is why Paul, I think, is like, I can't relate to humanity the way I once related to them anymore. I have seen something in Jesus that's changed everything. An event has occurred that's transformed my understanding of history and God and myself, and I can't speak of humanity without that event haunting me anymore. Because I've seen what? God does not stand with religion. He stands with its victims. Does that mean God stands opposed to the religious? No. Because this is beautifully shown on the road to Damascus when Saul's knocked off his horse. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Saul realizes what? Oh, I've not been persecuting for you. I've actually been persecuting you. And in Saul's worldview, how does God deal with those who stand opposed to him? He kills them. That's what Paul was on his way to do. And so what is Paul expecting to get from this God he's been waging war against? Everything he's been dishing out. But what does he get instead? A calling, mercy, Spirit. So God stands opposed to the system, but to those trapped within the system, he's still merciful towards them. Okay, anyways, what I'm hoping you get from this is that religion becomes this entity that tells us God's out here and up there. And what you need to be doing is constantly, whatever it is, sacrificing, praying, whatever, in order to get up there and out there. But what's revealed in Jesus is that God is not about any of that. He's always on a downward move towards humanity. And so in Jesus, sacrifice is redefined, not as something offered to God for God's benefit, but as something God gives to humanity for humanity's benefit. Now, okay, stay with me. Let's go back to Hebrews 13. Well, let's not go back to Hebrews 13 because we haven't been there yet. Let's go back to Hebrews. Only this time, let's go to Hebrews 13. Now, remember in Hebrews 9 and 10, we have all that sacrifice talk, okay? And it's subversive talk about sacrifice. The author is not telling us that Jesus is a sacrifice the way that sacrifice was understood, but that Jesus was a sacrifice from outside of the system that subverted and ruptured the system. Now, in Hebrews 13, this sacrificial language is brought back. Only it's completely redefined. Let mutual love continue in verse 1. Don't neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those who were in prison as though you were in prison with them, those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. Let marriage be held in honor by all, and let the marriage bed be kept undefiled, for God will judge fornicators and adulterers. Ooh, scary judgment language. Not if you understand that God is love. Judgment language doesn't scare you anymore. Keep your lives free from the love of money, and be content with what you have, for he said, I will never leave you or forsake you. So far, what do we have? We have all this talk basically about living in community with one another, and the thesis is let mutual love continue. And then you jump down to verse 15 and read this. Through him then, let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise to God. So sacrificial language is reintroduced, only this time it has nothing to do with blood. It's about a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that confess his name. And then what? And do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. The way we've understood sacrifice is in the context of religion. We have thought the whole concept of sacrifice was something divine to begin with, and so we see it upheld in the crucifixion. But sacrifice is something human. Even the prophet Jeremiah tells us as much about sacrificial practices we read of even in Scripture. What we see in Jesus is all of this stuff subverted, turned upside down, and ruptured, and reinterpreted. Why? Because God sends his Son from outside of the system into the system to cause an event that will rupture the system and rescue us from it. And it looks like what? Sacrifice is completely reinterpreted. It's no longer about us down here giving something to the God up there. It's about God coming among men and making the downward move and giving something to us. Therefore, sacrifice, or the will of God, is now to be reinterpreted as us continually making that downward move of serving humanity. And so, man, I just kind of want to pound something, but I won't. Get all preacher on you. And so now our very relationship with and to God is tied together with our relationship with one another. You cannot untangle it. Worship is not sending something up from down here. Real worship looks like loving each other. Real worship looks like living in community with one another, whatever that looks like for whatever community you're a part of, and meeting needs that need to be met, and giving yourselves for one another, because that's how God redefines sacrifice in Jesus. He rescues us from something that was destroying us. And that's how we enact that. That's how we continually live that way. That's why Paul says he fills up in his flesh what's lacking in regard to the work of Jesus. Nothing is lacking in regard to the work of Jesus, but in this exact situation, it might be, because the death of Jesus isn't giving you money if you need to pay your rent. But I fill up in my flesh what's lacking by paying your rent for you. Okay? I'm living out the event. I'm living in light of the event. I'm constantly bringing that event into the present moment by living out what it was all about, which was about the downward move towards humanity. Hey. All right, I promise we're almost done. Seriously, tray tables up, buckle up, guys. We are coming in for a landing. I told you to do that like 45 minutes ago. No. Oh, man, help me, Lord. Matthew 22, 34 through 40. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is just like it. What's the first? Love God. But there's a second that is exactly like it, which is what? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, one commandment is the other commandment. It's just like it. The command to love God is the command to love your neighbor. And the command to love your neighbor is the command to love God. When you love your neighbor, you love God. And when you love God, that looks like loving your neighbor. John 14, 35, Jesus says, a new command I give you. And the whole concept even of loving God is removed. And instead he simply says, love one another even as I've loved you. So now the command to love God is gone, and there's just this command to love one another in light of the love that he has for us. 1 John 3:11, we're told the message we've had from the beginning is what? Love one another. What's the heartbeat of Christianity? Loving humanity, loving each other. That's it. It's not about serving an external up there God who has sacrificial needs. It's about loving and serving humanity who have very real, tangible needs. And in doing so, that is how we love. That is how we worship. That's how we follow Jesus. That's what it looks like to really do this thing. We don't see that, though, because we fed the work of Christ right back into the religious machine and let it be reinterpreted. All right, now let me end with this. Luke 24, we have the men on the road to Emmaus, right? And I'll use this a little bit creatively this morning, but we have the men on the road to Emmaus, and they're disappointed and they're disheartened because the guy they thought was the guy is dead. And they're moping and they're depressed, and who can blame them? And suddenly a stranger comes out of nowhere and begins to walk with them, and it's Jesus, but we're told it's Jesus in another form. They're kept from recognizing him. They don't know who it is. And they're just simply hanging out and talking with some guy who they think to simply be some guy. And he begins to unpack the scriptures to them and show them how their expectations of Messiah were a little bit off. And actually scripture says Messiah has to suffer and die and whatever. And they're having this whole really enriching and beautiful conversation with this guy they don't know. And they come to the place they're going to lodge for the night. And Jesus, in another form, pretends like he's going to keep going. And they urge him to stay with them for the night. Why? Because they want to provide him with shelter. They want to meet his needs. And then they set a meal before him. And this stranger, whose name they don't know, picks up the bread to break it. And when he breaks it, their eyes open and they realize it's Jesus. But the moment they realize it's Jesus, poof, he disappears. And they say to one another, were not our hearts burning within us when we walked with him on the road and he opened the scriptures to us? What's going on here? A lot, but let me give you my creative interpretation of these events. When they did not understand God to be God, but simply to be a fellow human, they experienced this divine burning within them as though they were communicating with the divine itself. But when God became externalized and he was no longer part of the community, but now he's Jesus on the outside, he vanishes from their sight and they can't get a hold of him that way. Why? Because God no longer desires to be understood as the external up there and out there God who is removed and divorced from our community. He desires to be understood as the one who is present in our community. And so when we are giving shelter to the stranger and setting a meal before them and conversing with those who might have no one else to converse with, that's when our heart burns. That's when we're in communion with God. That's what it looks like to follow Jesus outside of the system. That's what it looks like to follow Jesus outside of religion. You don't need religion to do that. You need religion when your God is up there and out there demanding something from your hands. But Jesus shows us something completely new and revolutionary. And the whole way God chooses to inaugurate this new age by sending the Spirit not to some magic house on a magic mountain, but to live within your rib cage, divorced from structures and systems and temples, and present now in us. What does that mean? That means that I'm not really encountering God unless I'm encountering you. I'm not really worshiping unless I'm serving you. I'm not really following Jesus unless I'm loving you and living in community with you. But we still want to hold on to this mythical, external, out there, up there God, demanding things from our hands. Because then I can just do it and be me and it's all about me. But this inclusive gospel stuff, where, Matthew 25, Lord, I don't remember seeing you in prison or naked or without shelter. When? He's like, every time you did it for the least of these, you did it for me. Lord, I never neglected you when you were in that state. Every time you neglected the least of these, you neglected me. See, you follow God outside of religion by simply loving humanity and giving yourself for them. Remember, the call of Jesus is not worship me, but follow me, because following is how you worship. So God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those who were under law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. God sends his Son from outside the system, inside of the system, to cause an event that would rupture the system, rescue us from it, and introduce us to a whole new way of life. And that's what we have in Jesus. So can Christ be Lord of the religionless? Yeah. What does it look like? It looks like a community of people who look at the cross and instead of seeing the ultimate sacrifice that satiates God's bloodlust, they see that God is not behind a temple veil, but he's hanging on crosses with the suffering. They see in the cross that God is not some up there and out there deity calling us upward, but he's one who's constantly moving downward, who says sacrifice, the thing that pleases me, looks like you constantly going down and loving people. And half the time, little sheep, you don't even know you're doing it. So that's what I have to say this morning. And I'll let